A wildlife rescue van swerved violently, its tires screeching on the narrow gravel road before crashing into a tree with a sickening crunch. Inside, a panicked ranger scrambled out, clutching a cooler filled with sedated frogs, endangered species now gasping from heat stress. The lake that fed their habitat had suddenly gone bone dry, and the emergency pump station downstream sputtered to a halt with no explanation. Just 12 hours earlier, the water had flowed freely. The ranger stared in disbelief at the dry culvert, unaware that a woman named Karen, wielding a contractor and a clipboard, had just triggered a federal environmental crisis because she thought someone's water pipe was ruining the aesthetic of her backyard. This wasn't just a leak. This was about to become a disaster with national consequences. The morning started like any other in the neighborhood. Birds chirped, lake water lapped softly against the rocky banks, and Marcus stood in his garage sipping coffee while checking on the pressure gauges for the water line he personally installed 5 years ago. A government contract had entrusted him with maintaining a flow line from the lake to a federally protected wildlife station 2 miles downstream. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered deeply to Marcus. The water helped preserve an ecosystem that housed nesting herons, amphibians, and several species that had survived only because of the careful water balance they relied on. This wasn't just a pipe to him. It was a lifeline to a hidden world of creatures that couldn't fight for themselves. That peace shattered the moment Marcus heard the mechanical buzz of a chainsaw echoing from behind his yard. He frowned, set his coffee down, and jogged to the edge of the property, expecting maybe a landscaper clearing brush. But what he saw made his stomach drop. Karen. In leopard print yoga pants and oversized sunglasses, she stood proudly supervising a local crew hacking at tree roots and trenching into the earth right by the shoreline, right where his main water pipe ran underground. She didn't notice him at first. She was too busy gesturing with wild flair and pointing to a blue-painted PVC pipe that had just been exposed. One of the crew members called out, asking if the pipe was live. Karen scoffed and waved him off like she was brushing away a fly. She said it was just some leftover utility line from before the neighborhood was developed, and ordered it cut. Marcus shouted just as the saw teeth bit into the plastic. A geyser of water sprayed into the air, soaking the worker and splattering Karen's outfit in lake mud. She shrieked, not in horror at what she'd done, but in pure annoyance that her shoes were wet. By the time Marcus reached the scene, the damage was done. The pipe lay in 2 twisted halves, water still trickling out as pressure rapidly dropped. He knelt down instinctively, checking the break. It wasn't just severed, it was crushed. There would be no quick fix. And Karen, arms folded and voice syrupy with mock concern, asked why he had a pipe running under her section of the shore. It took everything in Marcus not to lose it. He explained, trying to stay calm, that the pipe was a legal installation under contract with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that it had been there long before Karen bought her property 2 years ago, that any tampering with it didn't just inconvenience him, it violated federal regulations. Karen smirked and said something he'd never forget. If the frogs wanted water, they could buy bottled like the rest of us. She turned her back on him mid-sentence and walked away as her contractor tried, sheepishly, to apologize. But the damage had already rippled beyond that muddy shoreline. Within 2 hours, Marcus's phone was lighting up. First, it was a ranger from the wildlife station reporting that the intake had dropped to 0 and their backup supply couldn't hold past midday. Then, a biologist from the preservation team called in a panic, saying that the sudden drop in water levels was triggering aggressive migration in the amphibian population, right in the middle of breeding season. The loss of flow wasn't just bad. It was catastrophic. These frogs and salamanders weren't like house pets. They had migration instincts hardwired into their survival, and their biology depended on constant hydration. Without the water, they'd die, or worse, spread disease while trying to escape. Marcus immediately drove to the cutoff, inspecting the trench Karen had left like a scar in the earth. He could already see mud crusting in the break, and the surrounding soil was absorbing what little water remained. It would take a full replacement pipe and new trenching to even hope to restore flow, and that would take permission, permits, and a legal brawl with Karen. When Marcus returned home, he wasn't alone. A black SUV was parked outside his garage, and a man in a forest green jacket leaned against it, arms crossed, sunglasses low on his nose. He introduced himself as Federal Wildlife Agent Parker, and wasted no time. They were tracking the water flow, he said, and Marcus's name came up on the maintenance contract. He needed answers, and fast. When Marcus explained what Karen had done, Parker's face hardened. "She cut the line herself?" he asked. Marcus nodded. "And she did it in front of witnesses?" Parker didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just pulled out a notebook and started writing. What started as a nosy neighbor dispute was now triggering a federal investigation. Parker warned that the water disruption was being treated as a threat to endangered species, and possibly even a criminal act depending on what was uncovered. Marcus knew that meant things were about to escalate beyond property lines and HOA drama. He offered to assist with the repair efforts, and Parker agreed to coordinate with his team. The two men shook hands, partners now, bound by urgency and frustration. That evening, Karen threw a party. Yes, a literal party. She set up canopies, catered finger food, and invited several other HOA members to celebrate her beautification project. When Marcus walked by on his way to meet a restoration contractor, Karen raised a glass in mock toast and asked if he needed a towel to dry off from earlier. Her laughter echoed behind him like nails on a chalkboard. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Because tomorrow morning, federal agents would be back, and this time, they'd be bringing warrants. By midnight, the frogs at the station were being moved into emergency tubs with oxygenated water. Biologists worked through the night in a frenzy. The community still slept soundly, unaware of the environmental emergency playing out just beyond their manicured lawns. Karen didn't realize that cutting a single pipe had kicked off a chain of events that could bring federal charges, environmental penalties, and the collapse of an entire HOA board. But Marcus knew. And by the time the sun rose, he'd already written the email that would start the process of turning her backyard into a federally protected restoration zone. This wasn't revenge. It was restoration with consequences. The morning after Karen's backyard celebration felt like a strange hangover for the entire neighborhood. There was no music or confetti littering the lawns, but something heavier hung in the air. A strange silence, broken only by the sound of a government-issued vehicle rolling slowly down the main street. Marcus stood on his front porch, coffee in hand again, but this time his posture was tense. It wasn't just about fixing a broken pipe anymore. It was about navigating a situation so layered with ignorance, arrogance, and federal regulation that even he didn't fully know what came next. The SUV stopped at Karen's curb, and out stepped Agent Parker, now dressed in a clean black polo with an official badge visible on his belt. Karen emerged from her home seconds later in a silk robe, clearly still in host mode from her celebration the day before, and walked toward Parker like she expected him to be another party guest. She asked if he was here to check on her landscaping permit, and Parker didn't even blink. Instead, he introduced himself in his official capacity and asked if she would answer a few questions regarding the incident with the pipe. Karen, perhaps still convinced that the world bowed to her HOA presidency, responded with a loud laugh and claimed the pipe was abandoned trash that she was within her rights to remove. Marcus watched from his porch as Parker calmly asked whether she had contacted any utility companies or surveyed the land before digging. She shrugged and said that property rights were simple. If it's on her land, it's hers to manage. Parker jotted something in his notebook and then informed her that the pipe she severed was part of a federally contracted water system that supplied a protected habitat downstream. Karen's smile wavered for the first time. She asked if he was joking. He wasn't. Inside the HOA clubhouse later that afternoon, Karen attempted damage control. She had called an emergency meeting, not to apologize, but to push a motion banning all non-HOA-approved utility lines along the community shoreline. Marcus sat quietly in the corner, watching her twist the narrative with the skill of a seasoned manipulator. She claimed the pipe was an eyesore, a potential hazard, and a breach of community aesthetic. Several board members, clearly under her influence, nodded along, their expressions more concerned about property values than federal consequences. When Marcus was given the floor, he simply held up a printed copy of his federal contract with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and handed it to the board chair. There was a silence that stretched uncomfortably long as they read it, line by line. One of the members asked if this meant the HOA could be liable. Marcus confirmed it could, especially if the board had failed to intervene when notified. Karen interrupted to say that Marcus never warned anyone. That's when Marcus pulled out his second folder, email transcript. He had sent multiple notices over the years, informing the board of the pipe's purpose and requesting its protection under HOA policy. Each one had gone ignored, and now he had digital proof. The meeting dissolved into chaos as the chairwoman stammered through excuses, and Karen began blaming the contractor for not asking better questions. But the room shifted. Doubt began to ripple through her once loyal allies. The homeowner from Lot 12 spoke up, saying he remembered the original email Marcus sent years ago. Another admitted he'd heard Karen joke about cutting government red tape one pipe at a time at a previous party. And just like that, the invincible image Karen had built began to crack. That night, Marcus got a call from someone he didn't expect, Karen's husband, Craig. His voice was low and tight, the tone of a man who'd been dragged into a mess he hadn't asked for. He said he wanted to talk in private. Marcus agreed, curious more than anything. They met at the far end of the lake, away from houses, under a boat shed where no one would overhear them. Craig confessed that Karen had known about the pipe all along. He'd shown her the plans when they bought the property. He had even warned her not to touch it. But she was obsessed with cleaning up the shoreline and had promised it would be fine. He told Marcus that she'd used HOA funds to hire the contractor and that the invoice had been buried under a landscaping maintenance category. What Craig didn't know was that Marcus was already recording their conversation. It wasn't personal. It was insurance. The next day, a letter was delivered to Marcus's home via courier. It was from the HOA board, signed by Karen herself, suspending his lake access indefinitely due to non-compliance with community aesthetic standards. The wording was so absurd Marcus actually laughed when he read it. They were doubling down. Rather than admit fault, Karen had retaliated, hoping to bully him into backing off. It was the worst possible move. Now, with federal involvement already in play, her decision to weaponize HOA authority was going to bring more heat. Marcus took the letter straight to Agent Parker, who added it to the growing case file. The federal angle was now shifting into allegations of obstruction, retaliation, and mismanagement of common property in a way that endangered protected species. That afternoon, Parker arrived in plain clothes with a second agent and quietly walked the perimeter of Karen's home. They weren't looking for a confrontation. They were collecting evidence. Photos of the broken pipe, the trench work, and the shoreline damage were taken discreetly. Karen, still oblivious to the depth of trouble she was in, posed for Instagram selfies nearby with a glass of sparkling cider in hand. She captioned one post, "Winning Lake Day," with a frog emoji. The irony was breathtaking. Meanwhile, the wildlife refuge Downstream was in crisis mode. Emergency water trucks had been brought in at cost to the government, and biologists were rotating shifts to monitor hydration levels in the amphibians and bird habitat. One of the specialists, Dr. Renna, emailed Marcus to thank him for raising the alert in time. She told him that had the flow remained off another 48 hours, they would have lost an entire generation of a critically endangered frog species. That message hit Marcus hard. He realized this wasn't just about federal law or local politics. It was about lives. creatures whose entire existence depended on people like him doing the right thing. As the week went on, tensions escalated. Karen launched a PR blitz within the neighborhood, painting herself as the victim of a bureaucratic overreach. She claimed she was just a homeowner trying to clean up her land and that Marcus was part of some deep-state nature cult, trying to take over private property. Her words, not his. She even passed out flyers door-to-door with a photoshopped image of a frog with a police badge. But it backfired. By the end of the week, multiple homeowners began questioning her judgment. One couple from Maple Drive, both retired forest rangers, requested a special meeting to investigate her leadership. They cited Marcus's contract and the emails now circulating the community forum. Karen panicked. She called an impromptu HOA meeting, this time trying to bar Marcus from attending. He came anyway, bringing with him not only a printed copy of his federal agreement, but a guest, Dr. Renna, who had flown in to testify about the environmental impact. As Karen tried to cut the meeting short, Renna calmly took the floor and began to lay out, in clinical detail, the scope of destruction caused by Karen's careless actions. Photos, statistics, satellite images, all of it. Karen tried to interrupt, but the room had gone silent. This wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about reality. After the meeting, Marcus approached Karen outside in the parking lot. She tried to brush past him, but he handed her a folder without saying a word. Inside was a cease and desist letter, a formal notice of intent to pursue damages, and a copy of her own signature authorizing the contractor payment from HOA funds. Karen looked up, her smirk gone for the first time. Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. Marcus had already won the next round before it even started. The storm was coming, and Karen had no umbrella. It started with a frog. Not just any frog, but a mottled green and brown endangered species whose sudden appearance on Karen's ornamental koi path sent her shrieking down her deck stairs like she had just seen a ghost. It was early morning, and mist still hovered above the lawns when the first of the frogs began migrating uphill toward higher moisture, now that the lake-fed marshland below had lost its regular supply. Biologists had tried to control the crisis, but with the pipe still severed and federal restoration permits caught in bureaucratic delays, the frogs did what animals do when their environment collapses: they scattered. Karen, once so proud of her perfectly landscaped backyard, now watched it slowly become a safe haven for panicked amphibians desperately seeking hydration. What she saw as an invasion, others would soon recognize as undeniable evidence that her actions had triggered an environmental chain reaction too large to ignore. Meanwhile, Marcus was working alongside Agent Parker and Dr. Renna to document the full extent of the ecological collapse. With photos, timestamps, and temperature data from the past week, they built a visual timeline of what had occurred. And it was damning. Not only had frog populations begun dispersing into residential areas, but the nearby avian observation tower had also recorded a significant drop in migratory bird activity. Without steady water levels, the insect population had been disrupted, triggering a domino effect up the food chain. Dr. Renna, methodical and reserved by nature, called the chain reaction one of the fastest she had ever witnessed. It wasn't just an accident, it was an ecological event with a human cause and a paper trail. A trail that led straight to Karen. By midweek, the Federal Wildlife Agency had enough evidence to take things further. A search warrant was issued for HOA records. Early one morning, 2 federal agents arrived unannounced at the HOA clubhouse and requested immediate access to all internal communications, payment records, and board meeting notes related to land use decisions and contractor activity over the last 12 months. Karen, unaware of the planned visit, arrived just minutes later in a matching tracksuit and froze at the sight of the badge on the lead agent's chest. She tried to say they needed to make an appointment. The agent replied, without hesitation, that the warrant was signed and active, and that interfering could be considered obstruction. As they began scanning digital files and photographing records, Karen stood speechless, arms crossed tightly over her chest as her carefully maintained authority began to evaporate. Inside the storage room behind the clubhouse kitchen, they found something unexpected: several unfiled invoices and receipts bundled together, all marked miscellaneous landscaping, and none recorded in the HOA's financial statements. Among them was a hand-scribbled note with Karen's initials authorizing immediate trenching along the eastern lakefront to remove unsightly piping. It was concrete proof she had acted with knowledge and intent. Not a misunderstanding. Not a casual mistake. Deliberate interference with a protected system, using HOA funds without board-wide approval. And that shifted the entire legal weight of the case. News didn't stay quiet for long. A local journalist caught wind of the investigation and published a story with the headline, "Pipe War Sparks Environmental Disaster in Quiet Lakeside Community." The article included a photo of the frog that had wandered into Karen's yard, perched next to her shattered lawn gnome, with the caption, "From habitat to hostile." It went viral in less than a day. The comments section exploded with readers calling out HOA abuse, environmental ignorance, and the irony of someone trying to beautify their yard ending up as the target of a federal wildlife investigation. Karen tried to issue a public response via the HOA Facebook page, claiming she had been misled by a rogue contractor, but screenshots of her earlier comments dismissing Marcus's warnings surfaced almost instantly. Her credibility shattered faster than the severed pipe. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself in a strange new position. For years, he'd quietly maintained the water system, never seeking recognition or praise. But now, his inbox was flooded with interview requests, local wildlife groups reached out to thank him, and neighbors began dropping off notes of support at his doorstep. One child even drew him a picture of frogs holding picket signs that read, "Thank you, Marcus." He didn't feel like a hero, though. He felt like someone who had simply refused to be bullied into silence. He knew how close they'd come to losing something precious, and that weighed on him more than the attention. With the story gaining traction, Agent Parker and Dr. Renna coordinated a public awareness event at the local community center to educate residents on the fragile balance of the lake ecosystem. Marcus was invited to speak. He kept his remarks short, letting the biologists handle the technical details. But when asked what he would have done differently, he answered plainly. He said that people needed to listen more, especially to things they didn't understand. That the real danger wasn't ignorance but pride wrapped in authority. It was an indirect statement, but everyone in the room knew exactly who it was aimed at. Karen, sensing her influence fading, tried to mount a desperate PR campaign. She commissioned a local PR rep to paint her as a misunderstood conservationist who was trying to remove unsafe infrastructure and got caught in red tape. She even hosted a backyard press moment where she pretended to rescue a frog from her patio and gently carry it to a flower bed, unaware that cameras were rolling when she accidentally flung it too hard and the frog landed in her neighbor's birdbath. The footage aired on the evening news, and the headline, "Karen Saves Frog into Flight," practically wrote itself. Whatever sympathy she hoped to gain was drowned in mockery. The courthouse was humming by the time Marcus arrived. Reporters stood out front with cameras angled toward the main steps, murmuring as if expecting a celebrity to show up. In a way, they were. Karen had become something of a local legend, not for the reasons she hoped. She had gone from HOA queen to national meme in just under 2 weeks, all thanks to a pipe, a frog, and a refusal to listen. Marcus stepped inside with a folder under his arm, filled with printed documents, photos, digital evidence backups, and a signed statement from the Department of Fish and Wildlife confirming the environmental impact. He wasn't nervous. He was resolved. The hearing today would determine the preliminary findings in the case, whether Karen would face civil penalties, or if the actions taken were serious enough to trigger formal federal charges. Either way, today was a turning point. Karen walked in through a side entrance 20 minutes later, wearing a beige dress that looked like it had been chosen to make her appear innocent and earthy. She clutched a designer handbag, and kept her sunglasses on until she was seated, only removing them when the clerk asked her to do so. Her attorney sat beside her, young and visibly uncomfortable, flipping through a yellow legal pad, as if hoping to find a winning argument scribbled between the margins. Marcus watched her from across the room. She didn't acknowledge him. Maybe she was too proud. Or maybe she finally realized she was in over her head. The judge entered, a middle-aged man with silver hair and a firm, no-nonsense expression. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. The first order of business was reviewing the emergency injunction filed by Marcus and the Federal Wildlife Agency to prevent Karen and the HOA from making further alterations to the shoreline. The judge asked if any party objected. Karen's attorney stood and attempted to argue that the pipe was not visibly marked as federally owned infrastructure. Marcus's lawyer, a quiet but lethal man named Whitaker, countered with drone images showing the pipeline's markings, documentation of Karen's previous awareness of it, and emails she had ignored that specifically warned her about its importance. Then Whitaker dropped the real bomb. He produced HOA internal messages, legally obtained during the federal search, where Karen admitted she knew about the pipe but didn't care because frogs don't vote. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Even the judge blinked twice before asking the clerk to read the line aloud. Karen's face went pale. Her attorney looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Whitaker added that Karen's actions had already cost the federal government over $32,000 in emergency wildlife transportation and habitat recovery. Then he handed over a USB stick containing a viral video of Karen flicking a frog off her patio during a fake PR stunt. When the video played on the monitor in front of the judge, the mood shifted completely. Humor rippled through the room, but it wasn't the kind that favored Karen. It was the kind that meant she had become a punchline. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he kept it simple. He explained the system, how it worked, why it mattered. He explained how years of cooperation with the Fish and Wildlife Service had helped restore the local population of marshland creatures and how a single act of vandalism had jeopardized an entire ecosystem. He didn't attack Karen personally. He didn't have to. The facts were already doing that. He ended by saying that this wasn't about property lines or personalities. It was about stewardship and the price of ignoring consequences just to look powerful in a neighborhood. Karen was asked if she had anything to say. She stood slowly and addressed the judge with a cracked voice that tried to sound emotional. She blamed misinformation, claimed she had relied on the contractor's opinion, and suggested she was being targeted unfairly because of her status on the HOA board. But when she said the phrase, "I only wanted to beautify the lake for everyone," someone in the audience chuckled audibly. Karen's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more. The judge thanked her, said he had heard enough, and recessed the hearing for a lunch break before issuing his ruling later that afternoon. Outside the courthouse, the scene resembled a circus. Protesters from a local wildlife foundation held signs showing cartoon frogs in hard hat. One read, "R.I.P. Pipe Dreams," another said, "Karen croaked the habitat." Marcus stepped outside for air and found himself approached by a woman in her 60s wearing hiking boots and a ranger's badge on her jacket. She introduced herself as a senior official from the Regional Department of Natural Resources. She thanked him quietly and said that no one had ever stood up to that HOA the way he did. That they'd been a thorn in the side of conservation efforts for years. Then she handed him a card and told him they'd like him to speak at an upcoming environmental conference. Marcus accepted it with a small nod, stunned at how far this had all spiraled. Back inside, the judge returned to the bench and announced his findings. The court recognized that the HOA and its president had engaged in unauthorized actions leading to the disruption of a federally protected water system. Karen was ordered to pay restitution to the federal agency totaling $82,000 in fines and remediation costs. Furthermore, she was prohibited from holding any leadership position within the HOA or related neighborhood governance body for the next 5 years. The restoration zone would remain under federal supervision for at least 2 years, and any interference would be treated as criminal trespass. Karen didn't speak. Her face remained frozen, lips tight, eyes locked forward as if by sheer will she could pretend it wasn't happening. But the damage was done. As the courtroom emptied, several HOA members approached Marcus and apologized. Some offered quiet support, others asked if they could help with cleanup. A few even expressed interest in having him run for the HOA board now that leadership was collapsing. He didn't answer any of them right away. He just wanted to go home. When he pulled into his driveway, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The fence that had been placed along the shoreline shimmered slightly in the golden light, with the new federal sign standing tall in front of Karen's once prized lounge area. That evening, a local middle school class arrived with their biology teacher to take photos of the restoration effort. Kids walked past Karen's backyard, whispering as they pointed at the sign, oblivious to her watching from behind a curtain inside her kitchen. It was surreal. A woman who had once ruled the HOA like royalty now couldn't even sit on her patio without federal eyes nearby. As the week closed, a letter arrived for Marcus. It was formal, printed on embossed paper. It came from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Inside was a thank you note, a commendation for environmental service, and an invitation to assist in developing future private land cooperation programs. They didn't just want him to maintain water lines. They wanted his voice, his approach, his willingness to stand up, not just when it was easy, but when it could have brought him nothing but trouble. And Karen? The HOA voted to hold a full board re-election. Most of her allies resigned before it even happened. Her replacement won with a near-unanimous vote. His first act? Reinstating Marcus's full lake access and naming the pipe area Frogline Reserve in recognition of the incident. A small wooden sign was added beneath the official marker with a cartoon frog holding a wrench. It said, "Please don't cut this. It's not just water." For the first time in a long while, Marcus smiled and didn't feel the weight of irony behind it. Karen's house went up for sale 3 weeks later. The listing mentioned lakefront access but made no mention of the fence, the frogs, or the thousands of dollars in fines. Marcus thought about putting in an offer just for the poetic justice, but he let it pass. Some victories are better left exactly where they stand, quiet, unshaken, and undeniable. A month passed, and the lake seemed to breathe again. The water flowed with steadier rhythm now that the new pipeline had been installed, reinforced with dual insulation and guarded by multiple signs marking it as protected federal infrastructure. Birds had begun returning to the trees, frogs croaked loudly during dusk, and dragonflies skated across the surface like nothing had ever gone wrong. But everyone who lived around that lake knew better. They remembered. The chaos, the hearings, the headlines, it had all left a scar, not on the land, but on the neighborhood's reputation and on the woman who once ruled it. Karen still lived in the same house, though she was rarely seen outside anymore. Her patio furniture had been moved to the side. Her garden ornaments, once lit up each night, now sat dark and half-buried in soil. The view she once lorded over was now cut off by a waist-high federal fence that reminded her each day where her control ended. Marcus, however, had become a quiet symbol of respect. Not a celebrity, but something more grounded. Someone who did the right thing and saw it through. Neighbors waved when they passed him. A few brought cookies or note. One child painted a rock with a frog on it and left it by his mailbox. He didn't go looking for attention, but attention came anyway. The local paper ran a follow-up article titled "The Man Who Saved the Marsh," which quoted a line from his courtroom statement. "Sometimes the smallest creatures remind us how big our responsibilities really are." His inbox overflowed with messages from biology teachers, conservation groups, even high school students writing papers. People were waking up to something bigger than a pipe. One Saturday morning, Marcus received a knock on his door. When he opened it, he found Agent Parker standing there in jeans and a casual jacket, holding a folder and a cup of gas station coffee. He smiled, more relaxed than Marcus had ever seen him. They sat on the porch, and Parker explained that the federal oversight had concluded its initial investigation and would now enter a monitoring phase. Restoration efforts were underway, and the area had already shown measurable signs of ecological recovery. Then he handed Marcus the folder, which contained a formal letter from the Department of the Interior. It was an offer. They wanted Marcus to consult on small-scale water distribution systems in vulnerable ecosystems across the region. It wasn't a full-time job, but it came with a stipend, federal clearance, and real authority. Not bad for a guy whose only goal had been to protect a pipe. The news of Marcus's new role spread quickly through the neighborhood, though not through gossip or spite. This time it came with pride. A few weeks later, the new HOA board held its first community-wide event since Karen's removal, a lakeside restoration celebration where kids painted frog masks, neighbors helped plant native reeds, and scientists spoke about the importance of balance between land and water. Marcus was invited to speak again, but he didn't give a speech. He stood at the edge of the crowd, letting the voices of children and the sound of returning birds do the talking. It felt right. A celebration without egos. A message delivered without microphones. Karen stayed inside during the entire event. Some neighbors speculated she watched from her second-story window, curtains slightly parted. Her house had not sold yet. Word had spread quickly through the real estate world that it came with complications, and most buyers lost interest once they learned that federal land now ran along the back fence. She had tried quietly to challenge the zoning classification of the restoration zone, even sent a formal complaint to the county, but the documentation provided by the Fish and Wildlife Service left no room for appeal. The area would remain protected for at least 5 years. No trimming, no building, no interference. Karen's dream patio would never be extended again. But Marcus didn't hold on to bitterness. He'd seen what holding grudges did to people. Instead, he kept focused on the work. Over the next month, he made regular visits to the wildlife station, monitoring the flow, checking filtration systems, walking with the scientists who had once scrambled to save frogs in the middle of the night. They gave him a nickname, the Pipe Guardian, and even joked about printing him a badge. One evening, as they released a batch of recovered frogs back into the wetland basin, Marcus stood knee-deep in marsh water, smiling as tiny legs kicked away from his hands and disappeared into the reeds. It was quiet, peaceful, and more rewarding than any lawsuit victory or courtroom ruling. The HOA, now under new leadership, began repairing its image. They rewrote several policies, installed transparency rules for spending, and created a new Environmental Advisory Committee, with Marcus appointed as a permanent member. Some people had resisted at first, thinking it unnecessary, but when they saw that these changes actually brought order and fairness without drama, the resistance faded. Karen was never mentioned during these meetings. Her name had become something of a whispered warning. What happens when ego overrules common sense? Her former allies on the board had either resigned or been voted out. The new board worked quietly, efficiently, and without posturing. Then came the moment no one expected. Karen made a mistake. A small one, but it was enough. She tried watering her dying garden by running a hose around the back corner of the federal fence and into a shallow ditch. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't even directly harmful. But it broke the rules. A wildlife ranger patrolling the area noticed the hose and followed it to its source. A report was filed. A warning was issued. Marcus heard about it the next day. He said nothing. There was no need. The system was working now, and the rules were being enforced by more than just one concerned neighbor. In late spring, another letter arrived. This one came from a National Conservation Foundation announcing that Marcus had been nominated for a Regional Stewardship Award to be presented at a gathering of environmentalists, state officials, and scientists. It was an unexpected honor, and when he traveled to the event weeks later, he stood on a stage beneath bright lights, dressed in a suit he hadn't worn since his brother's wedding, and listened as a speaker described his story to a packed auditorium. The crowd applauded not just for him, but for what his story represented: ordinary people defending the spaces that can't speak for themselves.